Hello, welcome to Chess Logic. This is the second game that I'm doing in the Magnus Carlsen series. This game was played between Kaiser Guenter and Magnus Carlsen. It was played in the year 2000. In this game, Carlsen defeated Guenter. Magnus is playing black pieces in this game, and the game begins with d4. f6, f3, d6, c3, and g6. You see that black is going to king's Indian defense. Now Guenter pushes his king's pawn, capturing all of the center port. Carlsen pushes his bishop, tucks it into the g7 square, making room for the king to castle, and Guenter does the same, pushes the bishop into e2 square, making room for the king to castle, both the players castle. And now Carlsen pushes his e pawn, Guenter develops his bishop into e3 square. You see the king's pawn being pushed forward. This is standard defensive mechanism here, and eventually we might be able to see the king coming up to a7 square, if at all, but here the bishop is in g7 square, so that won't be necessary. And now Guenter pushes his queen into d2 square, trying to build an attack on this diagonal here. Now both the bishop and the queen is attacking this pawn here, and this pawn is vulnerable, so it has to be defended. Carlsen simply develops his knight into g4 square, and it does the purpose of defending the h6 square pawn, and it's also attacking the bishop in the e3 square while it's defending the pawn. Guenter simply ignores the threat on the bishop and pushes his pawn into d5 square. So now we can see at this stage that this is a standard move from Carlsen, pushing the rook's pawn forward, making room in this diagonal here, trying to divert this pawn into f file and make the pawn structure vulnerable. Guenter captures it, Carlsen recaptures. Now if we take a closer look, Carlsen has developed a very good, beautiful pawn structure here. Guenter has not a lot of pawn structure. It's still underdeveloped for him, and his pawn in the queen's file, that is the d file, is unprotected by any pawns. And so now Guenter pushes his pawn and kicks the knight in this g file, trying to fend off. Carlsen simply captures the bishop and trades it off. This is a very good move, considering the fact that the bishop and the queen is lined up here, and it's a threat to this pawn here. So the trade is a good deal here. And after this, Carlsen pushes the pawn in e5 and attacks the knight. Knight has to move. Knight moves to d file. d4 square is chosen, and now Carlsen develops his queen into e7 square. See the rook being brought into the d file. Guenter opts for a non-poisson and captures the pawn, and Carlsen recaptures. And now Guenter pushes his bishop into the c4 square, checks the king, and Carlsen simply moves the king into a7 square, and the king is safe there. Guenter tries to bring the knight into e2 square, try to build an attack on this area perhaps. And now Carlsen kicks the bishop from c4 square, and it also makes room for the king to go back into g8 square, because the path for the bishop is now blocked here by the pawn chain. Now the bishop has to move, so the bishop goes back to b3 square, and now Carlsen pushes his pawn. This is eventually going to be a pawn storm, and there's not going to be a lot of options for Guenter if it keeps on going. Now the pawn is threatening the knight in d4 square. Knight has to move, so knight goes up to b5 square, and now the pawn continues and comes to d4 square, attacking the queen in e3 square. Queen goes down to d2 square. We take a closer look. All the pieces of Guenter are being forced down into the lower part of the ball, and not a lot of options are left for it. And most of the center part of the ball is controlled by the pawns of the black side. Now Carlsen develops his bishop into the diagonal, controlling all of the diagonal, and now Guenter finally finds time to move his knight up to f4 square, and now Carlsen kicks the knight in b5 square with the pawn push from a7 to a6, and strange decision by Guenter. He likes to ignore it and attacks the queen instead by moving the knight into d5 square. Queen has to move. Queen moves to e5, attacking the queen. Queen moves to e5. Now Guenter has the option to move either this knight into c7, or perhaps the other knight in d5 square, and it is now threatening the rook here, and Carlsen moves this rook into a7 square, and now Guenter brings his queen into the game and puts it as a support for the knight in c7 square, and it's also attacking the pawn in c5 square. Now Guenter tucks his knight into d7 square. It is acting as a defender for this pawn here, and now Guenter now Carlsen brings his knight into d7 square, defending the pawn in c5 square, and now Guenter pushes his pawn in g4, and that's the king's pawn for s1 square. Pretty ill-timed move, considering all the action that is happening here, perhaps. Anyway, Carlsen brings his rook into the action and puts it on c8 square, attacking the knight, and now Carlsen brings his knight into b5 square. Now this move is really interesting because the knight is played right in front of the pawn here, but if at all the knight is captured by the pawn here, the queen would simply be captured here, so that is not possible. And after this, the bishop and the knight is also under attack from the queen. Bishop might be able to recapture here, then again the queen will recapture again here, threatening the rook, and again this bishop would be lost. Or it's a terrible scenario. So that was not played, and this is what was played. rook goes into a8 square, and knight comes back into c7 square, attacking the rook again, and this time Carlsen simply captures the knight in d5 square, and instead of capturing the bishop in d5 square, Guenter elects to capture the rook in a8 square and captures it with the knight, and Carlsen recaptures. Now if we take a closer look, Guenter has given his knight and the bishop for exchange with the rook, and he's down a piece. Almost Guenter moves his bishop into a4 square, attacking the knight in d7, and Carlsen defends it with the bishop's move into e6 square, and now Guenter moves his king up to h2 square, defending the pawn in h3 and g3. Now he's foreseeing the move f4. The black pawn can be pushed, and it can be a major threat too, and the white king's protection there, and that's what happens in the game. And and now Guenter brings his queen back into e1 square, trying to bring some protection into the area. Carlsen develops his knight into f6 square to build an attack and perhaps capture this pawn here in e4 square. Rook comes down to c8, and bishop goes back to b7 square. Now the bishop is attacking the rook in c8 and the pawn in a6. Rook's coming down to c7 and attacking the bishop. So the bishop goes to a8. Now the bishop wants to keep this diagonal here, because the point is to attack and destroy this pawn structure. Simply capturing this pawn in a6 would not solve any problems for Guenter, and Carlsen sees that and captures the diagonal himself and fends off his pawn structure. Now he's forced to capture it, and that's what he does, and the knight recaptures, and we still see that the pawn structure is intact and it is attacking the pawns that is defending the white king. Guenter tries to defend it with the queen. Queen is lifted up into e2 square, and now Carlsen captures the pawn in g3. King is under attack, and at this point it is all game over for Guenter, because even if he recaptures, the black knight would simply come down to this position, and the rook, one of the rooks, has to go. A variation would be to move the rook into g1, and still would end up losing the rook here. Recaptures, then again black is up ahead by a piece. At this point Guenter resigned, because he knew that if he recaptured, the knight would come down and he would lose the rook. So I hope you guys have enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching.